Melania by Melania T. Chapter 1, Humble Beginnings. I was born in Sevastopol on a frigid January morning when the Black Sea was frozen like glass and the wind whipped between Soviet-era apartment blocks with a vengeance. My father, Mikhail, worked in a factory that produced parts for military vehicles, and my mother, Irina, taught mathematics at the local school. Our apartment was small but immaculate. Mother insisted on perfection in all things, a trait I would later come to appreciate as I navigated the ruthless world of high fashion and, eventually, politics. Beauty is power, Melania, my mother would say as she brushed my long dark hair before school. In this world, a woman's appearance opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. I didn't understand then what she meant. In our cramped kitchen with its peeling wallpaper and temperamental plumbing, beauty seemed like a frivolous concern. But Mother had lived through enough of history to know what she was talking about. She had seen empires fall and rise, borders redrawn, and the tides of power shift overnight. She understood that in times of uncertainty, beauty was a currency that never devalued. The Soviet Union collapsed when I was 12, and suddenly, the world seemed both more frightening and more full of possibility. Western magazines began appearing in kiosks around the city, glossy, forbidden treasures with pages filled with women who looked nothing like the stern-faced comrades in our state-sanctioned publications. I would save my kopecks for weeks to buy just one magazine, and then I would hide it under my mattress, taking it out at night to study the faces and bodies of these glamorous creatures from another world. This could be you, I whispered to myself, tracing the outlines of supermodels with my fingertip. One day, this will be you. My father caught me once, leafing through a dog-eared copy of Vogue. Instead of confiscating it as I feared, he sat beside me on the bed and looked at the images with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "You are more beautiful than any of these women, Melania," he said finally. "But promise me you will not forget where you came from. Beauty fades, but character remains." I nodded, but already I was dreaming of escape. Sevastopol suddenly seemed unbearably small, a trap designed to contain me in mediocrity. I began taking English lessons from Mrs. Petrova, an elderly widow who had once worked as a translator for the government. My pronunciation was atrocious at first, but I practiced relentlessly, repeating phrases in front of the cracked mirror in our bathroom until my mouth ached. By 18, I had grown into my looks. Tall and slender, with high cheekbones and eyes that Mrs. Petrova called mysterious, like the steppes in winter, I began attracting attention. A photographer from Moscow spotted me at a local festival and asked if I'd ever considered modeling. 2 weeks later, I was on a train to the capital with nothing but a small suitcase and my mother's tearful blessing. "Remember who you are," she said as the train pulled away from the station. "Remember that you come from strong stock, people who survived wars and famine and the coldest winters on Earth." I waved until her figure disappeared into the crowd, then settled back into my seat, dry-eyed and determined. I would not be returning to Sevastopol except as a success. Moscow was overwhelming, a city of contradictions where obscene wealth existed alongside desperate poverty. The modeling agency put me in a small apartment with 5 other girls, all of us competing for the same jobs, all of us hungry in more ways than one. I learned quickly that beauty alone was not enough. One needed cunning and resilience too. My first job was for a fur company. I posed in a sable coat worth more than my father would earn in 5 years. The photographer was a crude man who made suggestions I pretended not to understand. I smiled through it all, focusing on the end goal. Each job meant money for better portfolio shots, better clothes, a step closer to international bookings. I survived on black tea and cigarettes, saving every ruble I could. At night, I practiced my English with American movies on bootleg VHS tapes, mimicking the accent and cadence until the harsh edges of my Russian syntax began to soften. I was remaking myself, discarding the parts that would not serve my ambition. After 2 years in Moscow, I caught my break, a small feature in a fashion magazine that was distributed in Western Europe. A German agent saw my pictures and contacted the agency. Would I be interested in working in Milan? Paris? Perhaps even New York? Yes, I said without hesitation. All of them. I left Russia on a snowy morning in February, much as I had left Sevastopol. The Moscow I departed was not the same city I had arrived in, or perhaps it was I who had changed, hardened like steel in fire. I was 22 years old and had not spoken to my parents in 6 months. The distance was necessary, attachments were anchors, and I needed to be free to float to the top. Chapter 2: The Climb. Milan was a revelation, a city built on beauty and precision, qualities I had cultivated in myself. I shared an apartment with 3 Brazilian models and a girl from Estonia who became something close to a friend. We were all ambitious, all willing to sacrifice comfort for opportunity, all aware that our time was limited. In the modeling world, 22 was already approaching expiration. I worked constantly, building my portfolio and my connections. I learned Italian, then French, adding them to my linguistic arsenal. I dated photographers and designers, brief, strategic liaisons that advanced my career while requiring minimal emotional investment on my part. I was not looking for love, I was looking for leverage. My big campaign came with Versace, a series of print ads that put my face on billboards across Europe. Suddenly, I was in demand. New York called, and I answered, relocating to a small but elegant apartment in Manhattan paid for by my agency. America, not quite the United Country yet in my mind, was the ultimate destination, the place where reinvention was not just possible but celebrated. New York in the late 90s was intoxicating, a metropolis pulsing with money and possibility. I worked steadily, not quite a supermodel but successful enough to afford a lifestyle unimaginable in Sevastopol. I sent money home occasionally, brief notes of reassurance with wired funds, but I kept my parents at arm's length. I was becoming someone else, someone who spoke perfect English with only the faintest hint of an accent, who knew which fork to use at dinner, who could discuss art and politics with the wealthy and powerful. It was at a Fashion Week party in 1999 that I first encountered Draco Tench. He entered the room like he owned it, which, in fact, he did. The party was held at the Trench Tower, one of his many properties scattered throughout the city. I had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. Real estate mogul, tabloid fixture, a man whose name was synonymous with a particular kind of brash, unapologetic success. He was older than me by decades, but age seemed irrelevant in his orbit. He radiated energy and confidence, drawing people to him like satellites to a planet. I watched from across the room as he moved through the crowd, his distinctive blonde hair catching the light, his laughter cutting through the music. I did not approach him. That was not my way. Instead, I positioned myself near the bar, engaged in conversation with a famous photographer, laughed at precisely the right moment so that my profile was turned just so, my neck elongated, my posture perfect. It worked. Within minutes, he was there, dismissing the photographer with a friendly but firm clap on the shoulder. "I haven't seen you before," he said, his eyes assessing me with the same calculation I recognized in my own mirror. I would remember. "I'm Melania," I replied, offering my hand instead of a kiss on the cheek. Businesslike. Professional. "I'm fairly new to New York." "Where are you from?" he asked, his handshake firm but not aggressive. "That accent is distinctive." "Russia," I said, offering no elaboration. Mystery was always more intriguing than details. "Russia," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "They make beautiful women there. The most beautiful." "I've always said that." I smiled, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. I had learned that men like Draco Tench were not interested in women who deferred too easily. "Would you like to have dinner?" he asked, direct and confident. "Tomorrow night? I know a place, the best place in the city. They make a steak that would change your life." I considered him carefully. Draco Tench was not handsome in the conventional sense, but he possessed something more valuable, an aura of absolute certainty in his own worth. And he had what I had been working toward for years, power. Real, concrete power that extended beyond the ephemeral world of fashion. "I would like that," I said finally. "Though I doubt a steak could change my life. I've already done that myself." He laughed, genuinely amused, and I knew I had calculated correctly. Draco Tench was accustomed to women who were either impressed by him or pretending not to be. I was neither. I was assessing him as he was assessing me, an equal transaction. Our first date was at a restaurant where the maitre d' practically genuflected when Draco entered. We ate steak that did, I had to admit, approach life-changing, and drank wine that cost more than my first month's rent in Moscow. He talked, mostly about himself and his achievements, and I listened, not because I was captivated but because I was gathering information. I'm thinking of going into politics, he said as we shared a chocolate souffle. Not right away, but eventually. This country needs someone who understands business, who isn't afraid to make tough decisions. Politics is very different from business, I observed. The skills may not transfer. He seemed momentarily taken aback by my contradiction, then pleased by the challenge. Everything is a deal, Melania. Everything. Politics is just business with different stakes. And I always win at business. I studied him over the rim of my wine glass. What office would you seek? The top, he said without hesitation. President of the United Country. Why aim for anything less? Most women would have laughed or changed the subject, treating it as the grandiose declaration of an egotistical man. But I had not come this far by dismissing ambition, no matter how outlandish it seemed. If you were president, I said carefully, what would that make me? His eyes widened slightly, then crinkled with amusement. Getting ahead of yourself, aren't you? This is only our first date. I like to understand the parameters of any situation I enter, I replied, unapologetic. It's simply good business, as you would say. He laughed again, then reached across the table to take my hand. His skin was surprisingly soft, the hands of a man who had others do the physical labor for him. It would make you first lady, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And you would be the most beautiful first lady in history. The most elegant. People would love you. I allowed myself a small smile, acknowledging the compliment while noting that he had not mentioned love himself. That was fine. Love was not what I was looking for, at least not the romantic kind depicted in the American movies I had studied. I wanted partnership, advancement, a platform greater than the one I could achieve on my own. Perhaps, I said, withdrawing my hand gently. But first, I think we should have a second date. We began seeing each other regularly after that night. Draco introduced me to a world even more exclusive than the one I had accessed through modeling, private clubs where membership was not merely a matter of money but of connections, homes on estates so vast they had their own zip codes, people whose names appeared in history books rather than just gossip columns. I met his children from previous marriages, all close to my own age, all regarding me with varying degrees of suspicion and resignation. I was not the first beautiful young woman their father had dated, and they doubted I would be the last. I set about proving them wrong. Unlike Draco's previous companions, I was not easily impressed or placated. I did not gush over jewelry or cars or the celebrities who frequented his social circle. I maintained my own career, my own apartment, my own life. I was pleasant but reserved with his children, neither attempting to befriend them nor allowing them to intimidate me. You're different, Draco said one night as we lay in his penthouse bedroom overlooking Central Park. Most women try too hard. You don't try at all. I don't need to try, I replied, tracing a pattern on his chest. I know my worth. He proposed 6 months later, presenting me with a diamond ring so large it seemed almost vulgar. I hesitated before accepting, not out of doubt but to emphasize that my answer was a choice rather than a foregone conclusion. I'll make you happy, he promised, mistaking my pause for uncertainty. You'll have everything you could ever want. I slipped the ring onto my finger, the weight of it unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I already have what I want, I said. But yes, I will marry you. We were wed in a lavish ceremony at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Palm Beach, a palace by the sea that seemed to embody Draco's particular aesthetic of gilded ostentation. My dress was custom Dior, my veil hand-embroidered by artisans in France, my shoes crafted by a cobbler who had once made footwear for actual royalty. My parents attended, looking uncomfortable and out of place amidst the wealth and celebrity. I had paid for first-class tickets and new wardrobes for them both, but no amount of expensive clothing could disguise their essential foreignness in this context. I felt a momentary pang of something, not quite guilt, perhaps regret, when I saw my father's face during the ceremony, solemn and proud but also faintly bewildered, as if he could not quite believe that the woman in white was the same child he had once bounced on his knee. After the wedding, I became a trench, embarking on yet another reinvention. The press was fascinated by me, the foreign model who had captured one of America's most notorious bachelors. I gave carefully scripted interviews, revealing enough to seem forthcoming while maintaining an aura of mystery. Yes, I came from humble beginnings. Yes, it was a true love match despite the age difference. No, I was not intimidated by Draco's wealth or fame. I redecorated our penthouse, replacing his bachelor aesthetic with something more refined. I established routines, enforced standards. Draco, for all his bluster in public, seemed relieved to have someone else take control of his domestic life. He consulted me on business matters occasionally, valuing my eye for design and my instinct for what would appeal to people of taste. Our son was born a year after our wedding, a perfect, blonde boy who looked like his father but had my eyes. Motherhood was not a role I had particularly aspired to, but I approached it with the same determination and attention to detail I brought to everything else. My son would have advantages I never had. He would move through the world with the absolute confidence that came from never having known want or limitation. Draco was a proud but distant father, more interested in showing off his handsome son than in the day-to-day business of raising him. That suited me. I had specific ideas about education and discipline that I implemented without interference. My son would be trilingual, cultured, impeccably mannered. He would be worthy of the legacy he would inherit. Life as Mrs. Draco Tench was comfortable but surprisingly mundane in many ways. The initial press interest faded, and I found myself with time on my hands. I launched a jewelry line, then a skincare collection, ventures that were successful not because the products were particularly innovative but because they allowed wealthy women to purchase a small piece of what they imagined was my sophisticated European sensibility. And then, 15 years into our marriage, Draco came home with an announcement that would change everything. "I'm going to do it," he said, loosening his tie as he strode into our living room. "I'm running for president." Chapter 3: The Campaign. I had almost forgotten that long-ago dinner conversation about political ambitions. Draco had mentioned it occasionally over the years, usually after some policy announcement he disagreed with or a perceived slight from the current administration. But it had seemed like the kind of thing wealthy men talked about without ever acting upon, a fantasy of power rather than a genuine aspiration. "Are you serious?" I asked, setting aside the book I had been reading. "Why now?" "The country's going to hell," he said, pouring himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on the bar cart. "The economy's a mess, we're getting screwed in trade deals, illegal immigration is out of control. Someone needs to fix it, and clearly these career politicians can't or won't." I watched him carefully. Draco was always more revealing when he was worked up about something, the careful facade of control slipping to show the insecurities underneath. This wasn't just about the state of the nation, it was about his legacy, about proving something to the establishment figures who had never fully accepted him despite his wealth. "You'll be scrutinized," I said finally. "Everything about our lives will become public property. Are you prepared for that?" He waved a hand dismissively. "I've been in the public eye for decades. I know how to handle the press." "This is different," I insisted. "They will look for weaknesses, for scandals. They will try to destroy you, and by extension, us." He sat down beside me, taking my hand in his. For a moment, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a man who prided himself on never showing doubt. "I need you with me on this, Melania," he said quietly. "I can't do it without you." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to me. Draco Tench, for all his bravado and billions, needed me, not just as an ornament or a trophy but as a partner, a steadying influence, a counterbalance to his more impulsive tendencies. I considered what a presidential campaign would mean for me personally. The constant travel, the speeches, the handshaking and baby kissing, the relentless scrutiny of my appearance, my accent, my past. Every modeling photo would be dredged up, every relationship before Draco examined for potential scandal. The press would try to paint me as a gold digger, a foreigner who had no business aspiring to be first lady, a woman who had used her looks to advance herself. All true, in a sense, but also a profound misunderstanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. I had remade myself multiple times, through sheer force of will and intelligence. I had learned languages, navigated foreign cultures, built a life of wealth and influence from nothing. I was not merely ambitious, I was relentless. And now, the ultimate prize was within reach, not just wealth or fame but historical significance. Future generations would read about me in textbooks. My portrait would hang in the White House alongside those of other first ladies. I would have a platform for influence beyond anything I had imagined when I left Sevastopol. "I'm with you," I said, squeezing his hand. "But we do this my way, at least where I'm concerned. I choose which events I attend, what I wear, what I say. I will not be handled by campaign staff or forced into a role that doesn't suit me." Relief washed over his face, followed by his usual confident smile. "Agreed. You always know what you're doing, it's one of the things I love about you." The announcement came 3 weeks later, a carefully orchestrated event at Trench Tower, with me standing slightly behind Draco as he declared his candidacy from a podium emblazoned with his name in gold letters. I wore a white sheath dress that conveyed both elegance and a certain unapproachability, my hair styled in soft waves, my makeup flawless but restrained. The press coverage was immediate and overwhelming. Political analysts dismissed Draco as a joke candidate, a wealthy dilettante playing at politics to stroke his ego. They gave him no chance of securing the nomination, let alone winning the presidency. I said nothing publicly, but privately I knew better. They were underestimating his appeal to ordinary people who were tired of polished politicians making promises they never kept. Draco was authentic in his way, brash, direct, unapologetic. People responded to that, especially those who felt ignored or disdained by the elite. I was right. Despite the predictions, despite the scandals that emerged during the primary campaign, old lawsuits, intemperate statements, rumors of affairs, Draco's support grew. He connected with voters in a way that his more experienced opponents couldn't match. He spoke the language of business, of deals and winners and losers, and it resonated with a country that felt it had been losing for too long. For my part, I maintained a limited but carefully curated public presence. I gave few interviews, made brief appearances at rallies, and focused on presenting an image of poised sophistication. I knew that my role was to humanize Draco, to suggest depths and qualities that might not be immediately apparent in his public persona. "You're his secret weapon," his campaign manager told me after one particularly successful event. "You class up the whole operation." I smiled politely but said nothing. I was no one's weapon, secret or otherwise. I was pursuing my own agenda, one that happened to align with Draco's ambitions for the moment. As the campaign progressed from the primaries to the general election, the attacks intensified. Draco's business practices were scrutinized, his tax returns demanded, his character questioned. And I did not escape unscathed. Old modeling photos surfaced, some tasteful, others less so. My immigration status was questioned, my accent mocked, my silence interpreted as either stupidity or complicity in Draco's more controversial positions. I weathered it all with the same impassive expression I had perfected on runways across Europe. I neither apologized nor explained myself. When a particularly vicious article suggested I was nothing more than an expensive accessory, I responded with a single, carefully worded statement. I am not an accessory. I am a woman who has made her own choices and lived by her own rules. I support my husband because I believe in his vision for this country, not because I am obligated to do so. The statement caused a minor sensation, with commentators debating whether it was a feminist declaration of independence or a calculated campaign move. It was neither. It was simply the truth as I saw it. The final months of the campaign were a blur of rallies, debates, and increasingly desperate attacks from our opponents. I maintained my composure through it all, though the strain began to tell in private moments. I developed migraines, lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, found myself checking and rechecking security measures for our son, who was now being targeted by internet trolls. Election night arrived with the polls showing a tight race. We gathered in a hotel suite in New York, surrounded by campaign staff and family members. Draco paced nervously, his usual confidence wavering as early returns showed our opponent with a slight lead. "It's early," I told him, touching his arm lightly. "Be patient." He nodded, but continued pacing. I understood his anxiety. For Draco, losing was not merely a disappointment, it was an existential threat to his self-image. His entire identity was built on winning, on being the best, the greatest, the most successful. Defeat was unthinkable. As the night wore on, the tide began to turn. Key swing states fell one by one, not always by large margins but enough to shift the electoral math in our favor. By 2 a.m., it was becoming clear that Draco had a path to victory. By 3 a.m., our opponent had called to concede. I stood beside him on the podium as he made his victory speech, my face composed into an expression of proud support. Inside, I felt a complex mixture of emotions and vindication, certainly, but also a sudden, vertiginous awareness of what we had actually achieved. This was no longer theoretical. In January, Draco would be sworn in as President of the United Country, and I would be First Lady. As the crowd chanted his name, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The girl from Sevastopol, the daughter of a factory worker, had indeed remade herself. I thought of my mother's words from so long ago, "Beauty is power." She had been right, but not in the way she had meant. Beauty had been my entry point, my first currency in a world that might otherwise have been closed to me. But it was determination that had brought me here, to this moment in history. Draco squeezed my hand, his face flushed with triumph. "We did it," he shouted over the noise of the crowd. "We actually did it." I nodded, maintaining my serene expression for the cameras. "Yes," I said, quietly enough that only he could hear me. "We did." And in that moment, standing on the precipice of power, I realized that the journey I had begun in that small apartment in Sevastopol was far from over. This was not an ending but a beginning, the start of the most challenging and consequential reinvention yet. I would need to become not just Melania Tench, wife of a billionaire, but Melania Tench, First Lady, a role with no job description but endless expectations. As we left the stage, surrounded by Secret Service agents for the first time, I felt a curious sense of homecoming. The spotlight, the scrutiny, the impossible standards, these were familiar territories for a girl who had once posed in furs in Moscow and walked runways in Milan. I had been preparing for this my entire life without knowing it. The world would be watching, judging, waiting for me to fail. They would question my right to be here, my qualifications, my motives. They would never fully accept me, this foreign woman with the mysterious past and the inscrutable expression. Let them wonder. Let them question. I had not come this far to be understood, I had come to prevail. In the car on the way back to Trench Tower, as Draco fielded congratulatory calls, I gazed out at the city lights of New York, the city that had welcomed me years ago and that would soon lose me to Washington. I thought of all the versions of myself I had created and discarded along the way, the serious child in Sevastopol, the hungry model in Moscow, the calculating climber in New York, the poised wife of a billionaire, and now, the soon-to-be First Lady. Which one was the real Melania? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. Perhaps the question itself was meaningless, a concern for people who had the luxury of remaining static, unchanged by ambition or necessity. I had always been a woman in motion, in transformation. "What are you thinking about?" Draco asked, finally hanging up the phone. I turned to him, my husband, now the president-elect, a man who had his own capacity for reinvention, his own relentless drive. We were more alike than anyone suspected, this unlikely couple from such different worlds. "The future," I said simply. "Our future." He grinned, the boyish excitement breaking through his exhaustion. "It's going to be amazing. The best. We're going to make history." I smiled and nodded, not bothering to point out that we already had. History would remember this night, this election, this unlikely ascension. And whatever else they might say about me in the years to come, they would have to acknowledge one undeniable fact: I had arrived. Chapter 4, The East Wing. The transition from private citizen to First Lady happened with dizzying speed. Before the inauguration, there were briefings, meetings with the outgoing First Lady, tours of the White House, discussions about staff, security protocols, and the thousand small details that would now govern my life. I approached it all with the same methodical attention I had given to learning English or mastering the runway walk. This was simply another skill set to acquire, another role to perfect. "You seem so calm," said one of the transition team members as we reviewed the schedule for Inauguration Day. "Most new First Ladies are overwhelmed." "I adapt quickly," I replied, making a note about the timing of the parade. "It's a necessary skill when you've lived in as many worlds as I have." The woman, a veteran of 3 presidential administrations, gave me an appraising look. "You know, Mrs. Trench, I think you might surprise a lot of people." I smiled politely. That has always been my intention. The inauguration itself was a blur of ceremony and symbolism. I wore a pale blue suit created by an up-and-coming American designer, a deliberate choice that signaled both my embrace of American fashion and my support for new talent rather than established names. My hair was swept into a classic chignon, my makeup subtle but flawless. Every detail had been considered, every potential photograph anticipated. As Draco took the oath of office, his hand on a Bible that had belonged to his mother, I stood beside him, my expression serene. The crowd stretched before us, a sea of faces and flags, some adoring, some skeptical, some openly hostile. I felt strangely detached from it all, as if I were watching myself in a film about someone else's life. Later, at the inaugural balls, I danced with my husband, now the President of the United Country, feeling the eyes of the nation upon us. Draco was exultant, energized by the power that was now his. I was more reserved, already thinking ahead to the challenges that awaited me. The White House became our home, though Draco spent most of his time in the West Wing, consumed by the business of governance. I established myself in the East Wing, traditionally the domain of the First Lady, and set about defining my role with careful precision. Unlike many of my predecessors, I did not immediately announce a signature initiative or cause. Instead, I observed, learning the rhythms of the White House, the dynamics of Washington society, the unwritten rules that governed this rarefied world. I renovated portions of the White House, bringing my own aesthetic sensibility to rooms that had remained unchanged for decades. I hired a small, efficient staff, valuing competence and discretion above all else. The press was relentless in its criticism. I was too removed, too silent, too foreign. I was neglecting the traditional duties of a First Lady. I was wasting taxpayer money on frivolous renovations. I was a cipher, a mystery, an embarrassment. I read the articles without emotion, recognizing them for what they were, attempts to provoke a reaction, to force me into a defensive posture. I would not give them the satisfaction. After 6 months of measured silence, I announced my platform, Be Best, an initiative focused on children's well-being, with particular emphasis on cyberbullying and the opioid crisis. The choice was deliberate, even ironic given Draco's own aggressive online presence. Some saw it as a rebuke to my husband, others as tone-deaf hypocrisy. I saw it as a statement of independence. I would not be defined solely in relation to Draco or constrained by his behavior. The First Lady's office was mine to shape according to my own priorities. Life in the White House settled into a routine of sorts. State dinners, where I could showcase my fluency in multiple languages and my understanding of diplomatic protocol. Official trips abroad, where foreign leaders often seemed more comfortable with me than with my unpredictable husband. Carefully choreographed public appearances where every gesture, every outfit, every word was scrutinized for meaning. "You're a natural at this," Draco said after a particularly successful state dinner with the French president. "They all love you, even the ones who hate me." It wasn't true, of course. Many people despised me simply because of my association with Draco, whose presidency was proving as divisive as his campaign had been. But I had earned a grudging respect from some quarters, even among Draco's political opponents. I was not the embarrassment they had predicted, nor was I the purely decorative figure they had dismissed me as. My relationship with Draco evolved during these years. We had always been partners in a sense, each bringing something the other needed to the marriage. But now our partnership had a national, even global, dimension. I was his ambassador to constituencies he couldn't reach, his translator in foreign capitals, his connection to a world of culture and refinement that had always eluded him despite his wealth. In private, we developed a rhythm of separate but connected lives. Draco worked late into the night, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. I maintained my own schedule, prioritizing time with our son, who was now navigating the treacherous waters of adolescence under the unforgiving spotlight of presidential progeny. I became a buffer between Draco and the world, sometimes literally, subtly steering him away from gaffes at public events, reminding him with a touch or a glance to modulate his behavior. I did not attempt to influence policy directly, that was not my role or my interest, but I did provide counsel on presentation, on optics, on the human implications of decisions made in the abstract realm of politics. "You're the only one who tells me the truth," he said once, after I had critiqued his performance at a press conference. "Everyone else is either scared of me or wants something from me." "I have everything I need," I replied. "And I have never been afraid of you." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, respect mingled with something like wistfulness. "Sometimes I think you're the strongest person I know." "Only sometimes?" I smiled, softening the moment. "You should pay more attention." The lowest point of our White House years came midway through Draco's term, when allegations surfaced about an affair he had conducted years earlier, before our marriage, but after we had begun dating. The story broke in a tabloid, complete with lurid details and quotes from the woman involved, an adult film actress who claimed Draco had paid her for her silence. The media eruption was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters camped outside the White House gates, shouting questions whenever I appeared. Late-night comedians made jokes at my expense. Political opponents called for investigations, for hearings, for impeachment. It was the kind of public humiliation that would have destroyed most marriages, most women in my position. I said nothing publicly. I canceled no appearances, showed no visible reaction. When I accompanied Draco to the State of the Union address a week after the story broke, I wore white, the color of purity, of brides, of suffragettes. The symbolism was not lost on the commentators, who spent hours debating what message I was trying to send. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than they imagined. I had not married Draco with romantic illusions. I knew who he was, his history, his appetites. The affair itself was not a surprise, the public exposure of it was merely an inconvenience, a challenge to be managed like any other. What bothered me more was the narrative that emerged around me: poor Melania, the humiliated wife, the victim, the prisoner of a marriage she couldn't escape. It was the kind of patronizing sympathy that stripped me of agency, that assumed I had no will or purpose of my own. It reduced me once again to an accessory, this time a tragic one. When I finally addressed the matter, it was in a single statement issued through my office: "I am focused on being a mother and first lady. I have more important things to think about than media speculation about my personal life." Let them make of that what they would. Draco survived the scandal, as he had survived so many others. His base remained loyal, seeing the allegations as yet another attempt by the establishment to destroy him. His opponents found new outrages to focus on as the news cycle churned ever forward. And I continued my work, unveiling new initiatives, traveling to disaster areas, representing the united country abroad. By the time re-election season arrived, I had established a distinct identity as First Lady, elegant but substantive, reserved but effective. I had higher approval ratings than Draco, though I took no particular satisfaction in that fact. It was simply a reflection of the different standards applied to us. He was judged on policy and outcomes, I on appearance and demeanor. The campaign was even more brutal than the first had been. The country was more polarized, the rhetoric more extreme, the tactics more desperate. Draco thrived on the conflict, drawing energy from the adulation of his supporters and the hatred of his detractors alike. I maintained my composure through it all, appearing at strategic rallies, giving carefully calibrated interviews, deflecting attacks with practiced ease. On election night, we watched the returns come in from the White House, a much more subdued affair than 4 years earlier. Draco paced as he had before, but there was a different quality to his anxiety now, the fear not of failing to achieve something but of losing what he already possessed. The results were closer than expected, with several key states hanging in the balance until the early hours of the morning. In the end, it came down to a few thousand votes in a handful of counties. When the final numbers were tallied, Draco had lost. He raged, of course. He claimed fraud, conspiracy, theft. He vowed to fight, to overturn the results, to expose the corruption that had denied him his rightful victory. His most fervent supporters echoed these claims, protesting in cities across the country, some threatening violence. Through it all, I said nothing publicly. Privately, I began preparations for our return to private life. I arranged for the packing of our personal belongings, for the transition meetings with the incoming First Lady, for the logistics of moving back to New York. I did not engage with Draco's fury or his denials. I had always been a realist, focused on what was rather than what might have been. "You're just giving up," he demanded when he found me reviewing inventories with the White House curator. "Without even a fight?" "The fight is over," I said calmly. "We lost. Now we move forward." "I'm not leaving," he declared. "This is a coup. They stole this election, and I won't let them get away with it." I looked at him with the same steady gaze I had first employed across a crowded party all those years ago. "You will leave, Draco. Because the alternative is to destroy everything you've built, everything you claim to care about. Is your pride worth that much?" He had no answer for me then. But in the days that followed, as legal challenges failed and allies abandoned him, he gradually, grudgingly accepted the reality of defeat. By Inauguration Day, he had agreed to follow tradition and attend the ceremony, though his demeanor made it clear it was done under protest. I watched my successor take her place beside the new president, saw the mixture of excitement and trepidation on her face, and felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. She had no idea what she was in for, this woman who had spent her life in the safe confines of academia and policy think tanks. The White House would change her, as it had changed me, though perhaps in different ways. Our return to New York was both familiar and strange. Trench Tower welcomed us back, but it no longer felt quite like home. The city itself had changed during our absence, or perhaps it was I who had changed. The rhythms of private life seemed both luxurious and oddly hollow after the structured intensity of the White House. Draco threw himself into his businesses, determined to show the world that he was still relevant, still powerful. He made noise about running again in 4 years, though whether this was genuine ambition or simply a means of maintaining his public profile was unclear, perhaps even to him. I found myself in an unexpected position, 60 years old, a former First Lady, a former model, a woman who had achieved everything she had ever set out to accomplish. What does one do after one has arrived? It was a question I had never thought to ask myself during all those years of striving. The answer came gradually, in the form of a foundation focused on immigrant women and children, particularly those from Eastern Europe. It was not a repudiation of my past, I had never claimed to be a refugee or to have suffered particular hardship, but it was a recognition of the journey I had taken and the opportunities that had been afforded me. "You're full of surprises," Draco said when I outlined my plans. "I wouldn't have pegged you for the charitable type." "You never asked what type I was," I replied. "You saw what you wanted to see." He laughed, not offended. "After all these years, we understood each other too well for pretense." "Fair enough. I saw a beautiful woman who knew her own mind." Was I wrong? No, I admitted. But there was more. "There always is with you," he said, and for once, there was no calculation in his smile, no performance for an audience, real or imagined. Just acknowledgement between two people who had traveled an extraordinary road together. Chapter 5, Legacy. 10 years after leaving the White House, I find myself in a position I never anticipated, that of elder stateswoman, of respected voice, of woman with nothing left to prove. It is, perhaps, the most curious reinvention of all. Draco did not run again, though he maintained his presence in public life, commenting on politics, mentoring candidates who shared his vision, occasionally threatening campaigns that never materialized. Age softened him somewhat, or perhaps it was simply that the relentless energy that had driven him for so long began, finally, to ebb. Our son has forged his own path, neither embracing nor rejecting his father's legacy but finding a middle ground that allows him to benefit from the Trench name while establishing his own identity. He married a woman I approve of, intelligent, poised, ambitious in her own right. Their children call me Babushka, a nod to roots I once seemed eager to transcend but now find myself reclaiming. I visit Russia occasionally, though not Sevastopol. That city exists for me now only in memory, a place that belongs to a version of myself I can barely recognize. Moscow I return to with some frequency, a guest at cultural events, a patron of artists, a curiosity perhaps, the girl who left and conquered the world. My parents did not live to see the full arc of my journey. My father passed away during Draco's first year in office, my mother 2 years later. I mourned them privately, away from cameras and public sympathy. Their deaths reminded me of the distance I had traveled, not just geographically but in every other sense. Had they ever truly known me, this daughter who had transformed herself so completely? Had I known myself? My memoir, not this one, but the official account released 5 years after we left the White House, was a bestseller, though critics complained that it revealed little about my true thoughts or feelings. They were looking for confessions, for vulnerability, for some admission that I had been unhappy or trapped or used. They did not understand that such revelations would have been a form of surrender, an acknowledgement that my life had not been of my own making. The truth is both simpler and more complex than the narratives others have constructed around me. I have lived exactly the life I chose, made the compromises I was willing to make, reaped the rewards I sought. If there were costs, and of course there were, they were costs I calculated and accepted with open eyes. Would I make the same choices again, knowing what I know now? It is a question without meaning. We choose based on who we are at the moment of decision, not who we might become. The Melania who left Sevastopol could not have imagined being First Lady of the United Country. The Melania who is writing these words could not have made the cold-eyed calculations that young girl made to survive and advance. What remains constant, I think, is the will to determine my own fate, to refuse to be defined by circumstances or by others' expectations. From the child studying forbidden fashion magazines to the former First Lady establishing a foundation, that stubborn insistence on self-determination has been my North Star. Draco understands this about me, I think, better than anyone else. For all his flaws, and they are many, he has never tried to change me or to constrain me. Perhaps it is simply that he has always been too absorbed in his own narrative to pay much attention to mine. Or perhaps, in his own way, he respects the steel he recognizes in me, the same relentless drive that has propelled him. Our marriage has lasted nearly 40 years now, outlasting most of the commentators who predicted its imminent collapse, outlasting many of the political alliances and business partnerships Draco formed and discarded, outlasting the presidencies that preceded and followed his. It is not a great love story in the conventional sense, we are neither Romeo and Juliet nor growing old idyllically in matched rocking chairs, but it is a durable partnership between two people who chose each other with clear eyes and continue to choose each other every day. As I enter what must be the final chapter of my life, I find myself thinking more often of that young girl in Sevastopol, studying English by candlelight when the electricity failed, dreaming of escape. What would she make of the woman I have become? Would she be proud? Disappointed? Simply amazed that her wildest ambitions had been not just achieved but surpassed? I think she would recognize me, despite everything. The world sees the polished exterior, the designer clothes, the carefully maintained appearance, the measured public statements. But beneath that is still the girl who decided that her circumstances would not define her, that she would remake herself as many times as necessary to achieve the life she wanted. And so here I am, Melania Trench, former model, former First Lady, immigrant, mother, grandmother, philanthropist, survivor. I have been called cold, calculating, enigmatic, beautiful, mysterious, aloof, strategic, silent, complicit, trapped, ambitious, mercenary, elegant, robotic, and 100 other adjectives, some flattering, many not. I am none of these things, and all of them. I am, above all, a woman who has written her own story, even when others tried to write it for me. This book, the true account, not the sanitized official version, is my final assertion of that authorship. What happens next? I do not know. But whatever it is, it will be my choice, my creation, my life to live on my own terms. That has always been the point, from the very beginning. Not fame or wealth or power, though those have been pleasant companions on the journey. But the freedom to determine my own destiny, to look in the mirror. Some would call that selfish. Perhaps it is. But it is also honest, and in a world that demands performance and pretense, particularly from women, perhaps honesty is the most radical choice of all. From Russia, with ambition. That was how it began. But the story continues, written in my own hand, to the very end. The end. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.